All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're breaking down a really thought-provoking article by Roger Morrow over on the Coffee House blog. He puts forward a pretty bold idea that a unique American export, the art of regime change, might just be coming home to roost. And he's talking specifically about so-called color revolutions. And boom, right there, that's the core idea of his entire piece. Morrow calls it the boomerang effect. The basic thinking is, you can't develop all these tools and tactics to influence politics in other countries and expect them to just stay over there. So let's really dig into what he's talking about. So, to really get a handle on Morrow's argument, we have to first understand the product he says is being exported. What exactly is a color revolution, according to his article? Well, Morrow paints a very specific picture. This isn't just any old protest in his view. It's more like a branded, highly organized effort. He talks about seeing large groups of young activists, very clear and simple messaging, and, this is the key part, a level of funding and coordination that he argues points directly to foreign support. Now, what's fascinating is the cast of characters Morrow lays out in his article. He argues that if you look behind the curtains of these movements, you'll almost always find some combination of U.S. government agencies and this whole network of NGOs, that's non-governmental organizations, all pushing, in his view, toward the same goal. And according to the article, if these revolutions are the product, then a man named Gene Sharp is the architect. Morrow basically says that Sharp wrote the instruction manuals, the literal blueprints for nonviolent uprisings, which then got passed around to activists all over the world. And I love this analogy the author uses. He calls it the IKEA instructions for an uprising. He breaks it down into this simple, repeatable formula. Step 1, you assemble an energized youth movement. Step 2, you create a big narrative around election fraud or integrity. Step 3, you plug in the funding through those NGOs. And the intended result, Morrow argues, is a brand new government that's much more friendly to Western interests. So, you've got the playbook. Where did it get used? Well, according to Morrow, this thing went on a world tour. He gives a whole laundry list of examples where he sees this exact same pattern playing out. The article kind of walks us through a greatest hits list, starting with what he calls the absolute template in Serbia back in 2000. From there, it just cascades through Eastern Europe with all these similarly named revolutions. And then he connects that whole trend to the much bigger and much more chaotic uprisings during the Arab Spring about a decade later. But here is the absolutely crucial point Morrow makes. These did not all have happy endings, not even close. He lays out this whole spectrum of outcomes. On one end, you've got what he calls a tidy success in Serbia. But as you move down the line, he argues the results get, well, a lot messier, eventually spiraling into total state collapse and civil war in places like Libya and Syria. Okay, so after this world tour with, let's be honest, pretty mixed results, what happens next? Well, Morrow says the rest of the world, especially major powers, started to notice the pattern and began pushing back, hard. And this slide really gets to the heart of the whole geopolitical fight. It all comes down to framing, right? The author shows how, from the U.S. side, it's presented as this benevolent democracy promotion. But if you're Russia or China, you're calling it hybrid warfare. It's seen as a direct attack. Two totally different views of the exact same event. And Morrow doesn't just leave it there. He points to some really specific countermoves. He talks about Russia passing these super strict foreign agent laws, which are designed specifically to target the exact kind of NGOs he mentioned earlier. And he flags a recent report out of China that just flat out accuses the CIA of being the master puppeteer behind all of it. And this is where we get to the absolute core of Roger Morrow's whole argument. This is the big twist. After decades of exporting these tactics, he asks the chilling question, is that machinery now being turned around and pointed right back at home? I mean, that's the multi-billion-dollar question he's posing, isn't it? Are the same strategies, the same kind of language, the same organizational models that were perfected in places like Georgia and Ukraine now showing up inside American domestic politics? And why now? Well, according to Morrow, it's because Americans have seen this movie before. He argues that after watching it play out on the world stage for a quarter of a century, people have gotten really good at recognizing the script. They know what the playbook looks like. So what's his proof? Where does he see this happening? Morrow gives a few examples he thinks fit the bill. He points out that major political figures are now openly using the term color revolution to describe what's happening here. He also zeroes in on a specific move by a group of congresspeople he calls the Seditious Six, which we'll get to in a second. But beyond that, he just points to this general feeling of public unease, that the political games being played feel weirdly familiar, almost scripted. But the example Morrow really hones in on is this group he labels the Seditious Six. He's talking about an event where several members of Congress went public, calling on the military to basically be ready to disobey orders from the president. Morrow presents this as a classic move from the playbook, a direct attempt to undermine the chain of command, which is a key step in any regime change scenario. And this is where Morrow gets really pointed with his critique. He's arguing that what we call these actions depends entirely on where they happen. What's framed as a heroic pro-democracy movement when it's overseas, he suggests, gets a very different label when it happens in your own capital. So where does all of this leave us? In his wrap-up, Morrow kind of takes a step back and looks at the big picture, at the legacy of these tactics, and what it all means now that the boomerang seems to be headed home. He basically sums it all up as the promise versus the reality. The sales pitch was that democracy could be installed cleanly, like a software update. But the reality he describes? A total mess. A legacy of proxy wars, failed states, and just one giant geopolitical migraine. And he comes back to this number, 25, a quarter of a century. That's the key for him. That's how long he says the U.S. has been honing these tools. And that long public history is exactly why he believes Americans are now so quick to spot the signs and so deeply nervous about what they think they're seeing. And so Roger Morrow's article leaves us with this final, really unsettling question. He doesn't give you an answer. He just leaves it hanging there for the reader and for us to think about what does happen when the tools of revolution, so carefully packaged for export, finally land back on home soil.